There's a large number of people out there, including but not limited to the Zeitgeist movement, that strongly feel that if we ever got to what's known as a resource-based economy, or even a world without money, that we would be completely free. Free of all government, free of all dictatorship. And the thing is, that's not really the case. Because when you ask these people, who makes all the decisions? Who decides how many resources go where? And of what kind of resources? And who gets them? Really? Well, their argument is that simply everything would be decided by what's known as the scientific method. Come again? What the fuck is scientific method? I've looked into this, and I think I can sum it up. They talk about this scientific method as if it's this magical thing that just appears out of nowhere and contains the answers to all of society's problems. And wait a second. What's that? Holy shit. The answer to all of mankind's problem just magically showed up on this piece of paper, and this piece of paper just came out of thin fucking air. Wow. I guess scientific method does magically appear. That's not the case. Somebody or someone that has any level of intelligence is responsible for carrying out what we call scientific method. It's not just a process that appears out of nowhere. It's not just an answer that just falls from the sky and lands in our lap. We're not supposed to interpret this as the earth talking to us and telling us how much we have in resources to be able to sustain a given number of population of humans. Humans came up with scientific method. Therefore, humans practice this. Okay? So one cannot simply claim scientific method as a crutch for freedom. Because at the end of the day, you need one person or a group of people or everybody on the planet to use scientific method to delegate. So what is scientific method? Let's run down the list, shall we? Scientific method works like this. Step 1. Ask a question. The scientific method starts when somebody asks a question about something that they observe. Who, what, why, where, when, and how. In order for the scientific method to answer that question, it must be something that you can measure, preferably in numbers. Step 2. Do background research. This is the phase where, by accessing some large library of resources and information, i.e. the internet, i.e. scientific textbooks, i.e. the environment around you, at which you can see and measure. This is the phase where one would gather that information, as much of it as they can. Call it data, or data, take your pick. And they would take this information and carry it over to the next step. Step 3. Construct a hypothesis. Now here's where it gets sticky, because at the end of the day, a hypothesis is nothing more than merely an educated guess. And it's an educated guess about how things work, how the things in your environment, or the things or data pertaining to the question that one is asking came to be. An educated guess. Keep that in mind. Now one must state their hypothesis in a way that it can be easily measured. And also, the hypothesis should be constructed in a way that helps answer the original question. Step 4. Test the hypothesis by doing an experiment. Now this would be an experiment that tests the hypothesis whether or not the hypothesis itself is true or false. It is important for the experiment to be a fair test, preferably, and some might even say mandatorily, an unbiased fair test. One would conduct a fair test by making sure that they only change one element at a time, while keeping all other conditions or elements the same. Now, of course, this experiment or test would be repeated several times, just to ensure that the early results of the test or experiment were not an accident. Step 5. Analyze the data, results of the test, and draw your conclusion. This is probably where you'll find out if your hypothesis is true or false. Now, scientists who practice and use the scientific method will often find that their hypothesis is false. So what do? That's right, folks. They start right back at the beginning. Now, if the hypothesis turns out to be true, that leads us to step 6, communicating your results of your scientific method. Now, those results today we see published in scientific reports all the time. Chances are, if they're not in the form of a scientific report, it's probably some kind of government documentation that is notifying the public of a new discovery of some kind. Say, the effects of man-made global warming. And then, of course, there's always your child's school science fair project. I digress. Now, I think the scientific method is probably the closest a human being will ever come to being completely unbiased during an investigation of any kind. However, we're still human at the end of the day, which means we're not perfect. So herein lies the problem. How on earth is scientific method going to magically delegate resources or tell the public people what they can use, consume, and cannot use and consume to survive? I mean, scientific method doesn't just happen all by itself. Someone has to exercise the steps of scientific method. It just doesn't magically happen by itself. So to people of the Zeitgeist movement and all other walks of life who feel strongly that we could live free in a resource-based economy, in other words, we would never be dictated by a group of people known as government or by any one individual being a dictator, how could that be? What's the plan here? Do you teach every living, breathing, walking, all-consuming human being on this planet how to use scientific method? Or just a fraction of the population that represents the world's most smartest people? Who gets to use this scientific method? Those that do get to use the scientific method, how authoritative will they be? If the average Joe down the street comes to me, being his neighbor, and says, hey, I just use scientific method to figure out how much water you should be consuming. If I don't know anything about scientific method, or I do, why should I accept his conclusions? Should I do my own scientific method? Should I go through the steps of the scientific method on my own and then take his word for it? And if I do, what happens if I come up with a completely different conclusion? What happens if the amount of water I should be consuming for the sake of this earth and our survival is a completely different sum than what he came up with? What then? So no, scientific method is not the magical answer to govern our society. It is not the magical answer to a human being's freedom. Because see, the problem is at the end of the day, when we do, if we do, get to a resource-based economy, and you know what, I'll even throw that term out of the boat. Let's just say we get to a world without money, or a direct access economy. A world where there is no cost. Nothing costs anything. People can just grab what they need, when they need it, and use it to further the efficiency of their existence. Now in that scenario, where do you draw the line? Let's say best case scenario. Best case scenario. Instead of having countries, you have colonies. And there is one representative from each colony of people on the planet. And each of those representatives are responsible for using the scientific method and then submitting their results of using scientific method to all the other colonies of the world. What happens when one colony's results of a scientific method don't match, say, the results of 50 other colonies or all of the other colonies? Then what? Well, let's try this scenario. Take the 50 to 100 most smartest people on the planet and make them our delegators. Kind of like somewhat of a think tank. They sit around all day around a big giant round table and they use scientific method to delegate and dictate, yes, I'm using those words, delegate and dictate how we should live, what we can consume, what we can't consume, and how many people are allowed to be on the planet, how many kids you're allowed to have. Let's say that number of people is 100. What happens when 75 of the 100 members draw completely different or slightly skewed conclusions from the other 25? Of course, all 100 using scientific method. If we did get to that point in society, it wouldn't be the first time that two different sets of scientific method disagreed with each other. And I guess maybe that's why the world has so many scientific computer models that are at work here in our society today, deciding the weather, deciding what would happen if an asteroid hit our planet, because at the end of the day, a computer model isn't really biased. Or is it? Because then again, we have to consider the fact that the computer model is only working off the information that it's given. So what if I forget to give my computer model one important piece of information? Well, that's going to give me the wrong results. Is scientific method a good thing? Yes, absolutely. Can scientific method be used to govern society? No way. All we'd end up with is what we have today, a democracy. And some people actually believe that a democracy is a system of freedom. I can go to the polls and vote for what I'd like to see happen. The problem is you still have a minority, and that minority is dictated by the majority. You see, if I'm part of the 49% that don't want to see financial cuts to the education system, that voted against financial cuts of the educational budget for a government's education system, then I just got ruled and dictated by the 51% who voted for it. Is that really freedom? I think one should look up the definition of a slave, because I'm pretty sure that definition would be something along the lines of one who must live by certain boundaries, limitations, and restrictions. Now, considering that, I ask you, is a minority in a democracy truly free? Do they really get to do whatever they want? Do they really get to see the government do what they want? Absolutely not. It's always the majority, always, who dictates the minority. So in a society where there is no money, and let's say best case scenario, you have a group of people representing everybody on the planet that have to use scientific method to agree with one another first and foremost, because without agreement, they cannot unify a conclusion. Now, in an instant where they disagree, guess what those 100 people, or pick your number of people, guess what they're going to have to do to solve the discrepancy? That's right, folks. They're going to have to take a vote. And the majority vote will win. And please, understand, I'm not here to bash a resource-based economy. I'm not here to say it cannot work. What I am here trying to say is, don't buy into the illusion that it will be a completely free society. At the end of the day, someone's going to make a decision that strongly and negatively affects you. And yet, for others on the planet, it'll positively affect them. I strongly implore everybody to forget, abandon this idea of allowing scientific method to dictate and govern society. Doing so is allowing dictatorship and governance to be guided by a human hand. And if you truly want to be free, dare I say the Constitution of the United States is a good place to start. And there are other countries who have similar constitutions as well. Just something to consider, guys. Until next time, Viva la Rantolution, I'm out.